You know, guys, I've been thinking about the year 2011 a lot recently, and to be honest, like for the last decade. But this has been a weird time in my life because finally, the demons of 2011 have been excised. If you're not aware, I'm a huge baseball fan, and in the 2011 World Series, my team, the Texas Rangers, were close to winning the World Series. They were one strike away, they choked, came back in the same game, choked again, and then choked in Game 7, and it's been miserable ever since. Well, a couple days ago, they finally won the World Series, and what this means to me is that as a baseball fan, I am no longer defined by 2011. And as a Starcraft community, we sort of understand what it's like to be defined by 2011. And it was the height of our game's life, along with 2012. And whenever I think about 2011, it doesn't just all end and begin with Texas Rangers baseball and how them losing the World Series made me feel, but when I think about that era, I think about games like this. This is a match from 2011 between literally my two favorite streamers ever. The two streamers that I've watched more hours of than anyone else. Bottom left, IdrA Fields, the American Macro Machine. Then in top right, MorroW, who after IdrA retired from say 2013 to 2014, I watched a ton of MorroW. MorroW's this really funny Swedish guy, really talented macro player, a guy who was more tongue-in-cheek and sort of European in his humor than the brash IdrA Fields, but in his own right was very funny and wasn't afraid to let a quip loose. IdrA checking for 2 racks here with the drone. There was a famous MLG match that IdrA lost to Dario TLO Wunsch, where TLO proxied 2 barracks there in the middle of the map and fucking 2 racks to IdrA. The game dropped and IdrA had lost all but 5 workers, and it would have been 5 workers to 10, and IdrA maybe could have come back, real long shot. A lot of players would have very greedily said, oh yeah, I want the regame, as IdrA scouts the factory there. But IdrA sort of honorably said oh no, I only had 5 workers left, I was clearly too far behind to win, I was probably going to leave anyway. TLO can just have the win. As IdrA scouts a reactor, it was very common for Terran players to make the reactor in the wall-in, but the reactor metagame, as far as it relates to wall-ins and Hellion builds, wasn't really settled until the beginning of 2012, as weird as that is to say. So let's just think about some StarCraft 2 timeline here. In March of 2010, the beta came out. People were doing ridiculous rushes and cheeses against each other. The map pool was maps like Steppes of War, Metalopolis, Lost Temple, Kulos Ravine. This is Metalopolis, if you're not aware. It's actually a pretty good map, except you could spawn in close positions. But one thing that made this interesting was the fact that IdrA was facing MorroW, and they were both hard-committed macro players. But MorroW was a guy who knew that IdrA was a very, very talented macro player in his own regard, and he would often break out the cheese against IdrA, even though more likely than not, he was a macro player who would go for long-winded, late-game style builds himself. So that was one interesting thing that would always revolve around the metagame of playing against IdrA was, okay, if I'm a macro player, am I going to try to out-macro IdrA, beat him at his own game, which was seen as nearly impossible. Remember, this guy went to Korea, lasted longer than any other foreigner, made it really deep in GSL, and was the best Brood War player out of all the foreigners. So the idea that you were just going to take a fast third base and go toe-to-toe with this guy and let him do whatever the hell he wanted was laughable. This guy was absolutely insanely talented and insanely scary to play against in a macro game. So what this meant was even if you were a player like Rhett or like MorroW who favored a macro style, you were way more likely to play super aggro against IdrA. There was a tournament, MLG Orlando 2011, where Boxer's team, the Slayers Terrans, really utilized Blue Flame Hellion drop and elevator play, which if you don't know, elevator play is whenever you make a medevac or a warp prism and put it right on the lip of a plateau or a high ground and transport stuff that's on the low ground up into the high ground. It's very hard to do unless you have a warp prism and you can just statically drop stuff, but the micro is a little bit harder than you would expect because the stuff on the low ground tries to derp out and walk around the ramp, and an intelligent player will push you back and be ready for that. But the idea is that the Zerg will not have creep around the ramp and that you can complete the drop and sort of isolate the main and the natural. And the Slayers Terrans, Slayers was a team owned by Boxer. They really showed this build off to an incredible extent with excessive force at a tournament they went to, an MLG in the mid-2011s, Orlando. So around that time, it became a huge part of the metagame. Oh, an elevator play. Terran, especially on this map, Metalopolis, where there's just an insane amount of room in the main. The thought was that Terran could really pressure you and use the amount of main space to do an elevator play. But whenever this got figured out, as they did throughout Starcraft 2 history, Zergs figured out how to defend against it, as IdrA's trying to wrestle tower control back from MorroW. So if you look at the minimap, IdrA has phenomenal vision of his main. He's laid a creep tumor down. He's laid more than one creep tumors down in his main. He has overlords scouting right where the drop is going to be, as well as one in the smoke. And he's going to pull his queens up to the high grounds and make more lings. MorroW screaming forward, targets fires a couple banes. Great micro there, but unfortunately the last bane that was shot does zap the Marines. It's a great example of the sort of razor's edge type micro you have to do as Terran, especially in this era before the speed boost. Now when the speed boost came out, it really gave Terran the ability to run around and abuse with medevacs with impunity, but the way that elevator pushes worked pre-medevac speed boost is that whenever IdrA was able to kill some of those Marines and get his queens up, the push was then stalled. MorroW had to run back because IdrA could get pot shots off on those medevacs and make it where they took hull damage. Now I know it sounds like I'm prattling on a bit here as Hellions are scouting around wanting to take shots at the incoming lings, but the mutas are out. MorroW retreating. It looks like he might think about picking up. He does not know mutas are out. And this is what I'm talking about. If this was Heart of the Swarm, he could just fly away with impunity, but as it stands, he's going to lose all the units in the medevacs, and Greg Idrfields is starting to take a bit of an advantage here as his third base kicks in, and MorroW really has not done any damage, and he says, well, shit, I'm just going to have to run back in and drop the units off. And that is the difference between speed boosted medevacs like you would see in Heart of the Swarm, the infamous Ignite afterburners that the crowd at MLG Dallas 2013 would chant along with by saying boo in reference to the boost. IdrA picking off the SCVs, making the turrets. Great job by him. That's something you always want to do as the Mutalisk player. Pick off those turrets, pick off those add-ons, and target the things that really screw up the Terran macro, like killing workers. Pick off the singular turrets. And one thing that's interesting to see is, especially in this 2010-2011 era, is players would place buildings in the same way that they would in Brood War. That sort of two turrets at the top of my barracks placed together, that's a very Brood War-esque turret location. And with the armory about 60% done, MorroW is going to want to tech up into a Thor because they do splash damage and bonus damage to light. It was seen as the answer to Muta. IdrA hasn't scouted this yet, but a PF is being started here for MorroW, and this is always a huge part of the game. Do you have defense over here? MorroW is the kind of guy that always would. A very intelligent macro player that didn't cut corners or flip coins. A guy like Marine King Prime would have half of his army out on the map pressuring creep, and the other half trying to be doom drop into your main, whereas MorroW understands, okay, until the PF gets up, until the turret gets up, this third base is very vulnerable, and if IdrA runs in here with Mutaling Bane and cancels this third, I'm probably going to be too far behind to win once I reestablish a third. IdrA will have a fourth, maybe a fifth, he'll probably be maxed. He'll easily have 2-2, and the standard late game was after the Mutaling Bane mid game, you would go into Broodlord and a few infestors just to try to finish it. IdrA destroying the production of MorroW, and he's almost going to kill the factory outright. As when you start with 8 mutas, it's good to get turrets and add-ons, but once you get about an entire page of mutas, you can start to trade. A little bit tricky like this, but without medevacs, it's actually okay. Fighting on the corner, over the dead space, IdrA completely controlled that engagement, and MorroW says, oh shit, he might kill my factory proper, as he lifts it and starts to run away. And the reason IdrA wants to kill that factory is because he wants to limit the tank and Thor count. We saw a game on my channel recently, IdrA vs Boxer. Boxer was always famous for going for these 2 factory styles where he would get Thors and tanks. Thors and tanks were just ludicrously powerful against Zerg at this time, and there was a reason why you never saw Roach Hydra styles used. And even if you didn't make tanks, they would still lose against well upgraded bio with Medevac and Marauder. IdrA continuing to expand. One dynamic of Metalopolis in the macro game was how easy it was for Terran to drop from their main to the other bases. So frequently Zerg, if they took that 12 o'clock, they would have to make static defense, and then the other main base that you could spawn in, like if, for instance, the Terran player spawned at the 12 o'clock close by ground position, that was seen as virtually indefensible if the Terran spawned where he is now, and basically you were pretty much relegated to taking only the 12 o'clock. You weren't really in a position where you were sitting there to yourself confidently saying, okay, yeah, that massive main plateau with all that free airspace I can defend in a late game. Like, Terran was going to drop shit up there, they were going to drop stuff up there. Like, it was very easy to get it up, and we can see right there a Thor narrowly escaping, and MorroW doing a big push saying, well, holy crap, like, he's going to kill my factory. His muta count so high. Mutiling Brain screaming forward, killing a lot of bio, but the Banes not really detonating on the money targets, the Marines, but most of the tanks go down. IdrA does not have Bane speed. I don't think he's researching that. I think he straight forgot that. Infestors come out here, so even if IdrA loses this base, it's not going to be the end of the world. Once you get a handful of Infestors out with Pathogen Glands, the plus damage to armored insta-cast Snare Fungal is really going to do a plethora of work for you. IdrA really behind in upgrades here, though. He went for a very tech-heavy style, where he rushed up into Broodlord Infestor after sort of trying to get momentum with Muta. But we can see here he has tower control to scout the middle gold. He has the bottom base, the 6 o'clock, and he has Overlord creep dropping the natural 4th of MorroW. MorroW really needs to get work done. IdrA at an absolute power trough here. He can't really do damage with the mutas. He's just using them to defend. He's anticipating a MorroW drop at the 12 o'clock or a MorroW elevator play to try to get control of that area, keeping his mutas up there, keeping the infestors on low ground, and really not much bio here for the Swede. And IdrA runs down here, throws infested Terran down, fungals the army as well as a tank and some mutas, brings his mutas around, and the medevacs are what got fungled, but without that many mutas out, he will target fire the Marines, because once the Marines go down, nothing can shoot up. And reinforcements, though, for MorroW are already out. Again, this is a talented macro player. This isn't a guy that's just going to roll over. IdrA continuing to maintain control of the middle of the map. I absolutely love to see this stuff from IdrA, because he's not in a position where MorroW's constantly pressuring him and sort of messing with him and fooling with him and keeping him on the back foot. IdrA has really stayed in control of this game. And with one Marine out here, MorroW is trying to be annoying and pressure that base, and that's one of those bases where it's so brazen you almost take it just to make sure the Terran can't take it, and you sort of know you're going to lose that. And that was one of those bases where when you were sitting here as tier 3 Zerg and Wings of Liberty and there was no lurker, and you're sitting there to yourself saying, oh, I want to control the space with the high ground, you literally just can't against tier 3. Or even, not forget tier 3, but just like upgraded Marines. As you see tanks being picked off here, that's almost good for MorroW. The tank is absolutely worthless against the Broodlord and will just friendly fire, so a lot of times as Terran it feels worthless to have tanks versus Broodlords, and Whenever you get surprised broodlorded, you almost just want to like send your tanks away or drop them in the main. Oftentimes, this is what Metalopolis TVZ revolved around, were these gold bases. And if you didn't tech up into Broodlord, you were really in a tough spot as Zerg to try to break that PF. And finally, MorroW flies a drop into those mutas. As IdrA kept those mutas there all freaking game. He knew MorroW would do it. He knows that Terran sees, okay, Zerg's taking that base. My main is right here. I'm just going to go drop that, LOL. No big deal. Well, there were mutas patrolling there the whole damn time. You never see the patrol command used properly. It's very underrated in StarCraft 1 and 2. The thing about StarCraft 2 is it'll always work, and you can shift queue it with other stuff. In Brood War, it's real half-assed. IdrA using patrol again. This is beautiful play. IdrA was a guy who respected MorroW but didn't necessarily like him. As we see Ghosts coming up, Ghosts were very good at the beginning of StarCraft 2, but very underused. And with Vikings out here, no Corruptors, IdrA is sort of up shit creek. Muta's very bad at one-on-one fighting, and oftentimes Zerg would use fungal spam on Vikings to prevent the Vikings from killing the Broodlords. And MorroW throwing in his reserves, like the RAF, Banes coming in here. They want to make big connections, but with only 3 skill Banes, they fail to. And suddenly, nightmare fuel for the Zerg as IdrA has 6 Broodlords with no support. And the mutas are out there, but he sees, oh, well, he has as many Vikings as I have mutas. And as the Broodlords start to morph, we can see IdrA is very low on money. His phenomenal macro is enabling him to keep MorroW on the back foot and enables him to parlay that fight into an 80 supply advantage. But let's be honest, folks, that was a very weird fight considering how much momentum IdrA had. And a lot of what IdrA would always complain about would be like, even when he would win games like this, it would be by the hair of his chinny chin. He would barely freaking win, and he'd be doing it against, let's be honest, like 400 Terrans. MorroW was great, and I loved them, but he wasn't exactly MVP at the peak of his powers. And IdrA knew what happens when I play MVP and we get close positions. Well, he lost in the round of 8 of GSL, and MorroW GG's. So, if, fucking hell, we can give the closing thoughts on this game real briefly here. If we consider this late game approach where IdrA went for Broodlord and Fester, notice that the idea here isn't to spam mass Broodlord, make 50 spines, make 30 infestors, and to sit. IdrA gets the Broodlords, uses the Broodlords to siege a turtled base that cannot be attacked on the ground, break that, and continue to push forward to end the game. As maps got bigger and bigger, and Zerg got more and more steady, it allowed for them to play completely defensive and really not have to worry about closing the game because the Queen was so good and the maps were so big. The map does not really favor IdrA here. It's very hard for him to hold 12. It's very hard for him to hold 6. He wants to make Broodlords and win. So if you like that cast, make sure to sub for more and click my playlists because they rock.